record. So I have this, and then we're going to go. Cool. So what we want to do is we want to talk through. Brilliant. We want to talk through first and foremost the concept of energy balance. And I mean, this is a time where it provides us a lot of challenge. It provides us some, and I've seen both, and particularly working across the continuum with clients at the moment. We're seeing it from a point of view of some people are struggling to eat enough. And then there's the obvious one in terms of just boredom eating and kind of just general management of behaviors and things like that. As well as that, hey, Sonia, as well as that, there is consideration or worry, if you like, around just quote loss of gains, in the sense of, because we're not necessarily having exposure to as much resistance and that kind of stuff, and weight training, one of the common themes that we've seen over the past couple of days is this kind of like loss of muscle mass and all the rest of it. And so we just want to talk through that as well. So the first kind of thing that we want to touch upon is, as I said, just this notion of energy balance, and first and foremost, our body composition and to some extent our health is going to be governed by this notion of kind of calories in versus calories out. From a point of view of health is as a kind of a more holistic thing, isn't necessarily as simple as that, but in terms of the amount of body fat that we have is governed by this kind of law of thermodynamics. And so what we have is, I am gonna share my screen. So what we have is this idea that, and if you've heard me before, we have this concept of calorie deficit, energy being managed by this 3,500 calories equals 1 pound of body fat. And so within this, I've lost myself because there we go, that's better. Within this, what this means is, so say if you have a total daily energy expenditure of 3,000 calories, you can literally calculate your rate of fat loss and fat gain. Now, I'll fundamentally say is 1 pound of fat loss, of fat, is about the size of my fist, something like that, okay? Size of my fist. That's 1 pound of fat. Now, the idea of that and what that looks like on the scales is going to be completely different. It's completely different. There's so many variables that impact scales. I'm very fortunate enough to work with like weightlifting, British weightlifting, and kind of do the nutrition for that. And obviously that's a weight making sport. And there are so many variables that impact scale weight. Everything from stress levels, like even in terms of if you've had a hard training day, there's concept of cellular inflammation, because you will naturally hold on to more water. So after a hard training day, we would expect you to weigh heavier. Your carbohydrate intake, your fiber intake, to some extent your fat intake, all of these variables, your hydration status, all of these variables basically impact scale weight. So we want to separate this notion of body fat in its actual sense versus scale weight and all that kind of stuff. And maybe later down the line we'll do some form of we'll talk through the variables of scale weight and how we can kind of interpret that effectively. So if we kind of lose that attachment to the scales and kind of have this idea of body composition management, we can literally kind of, if we look at it very objectively, we can manage our body composition from a kind of a pure mathematics game. And once you kind of start to understand it, you can kind of predict scale weight fluctuations that kind of come with that. And so this is an example here that you have someone's total daily energy expenditure of 3,000 calories. And then if they, for 7 days, they have 2,500 calories, they basically create an energy deficit of 500 calories. And then as a result, 500 times that by 7, and it equals 3,500. And it just becomes this process of banking calories. Now, obviously, we're not all in the game of fat loss. And so that's a calculation for 1 pound of fat loss within a week. But what it does do is start to bring around kind of consideration of kind of, first and foremost, particularly if we are in this this environment, this food environment, we're stuck in our own flats and homes, which isn't exactly optimal, and food focus is arguably a bit higher. Then we can start to just separate this notion of kind of good and bad food and understand that fundamentally a calorie is a calorie. Now, there is some further consideration around that, which I will go through. I'll go through shortly. But that's the first message, in the sense of we just need to fundamentally manage our energy balance to go get through this time, and we can mitigate and come out of the other side of this kind of coronavirus relatively unscathed. And that's the kind of the first point to kind of note. That also has some translation in terms of performance as well. Now, what we're talking about here, we're talking about particularly in the context of those that are worried about maybe putting on a bit of body fat, we're worried about kind of like say maybe not having access to their normal foods and that kind of thing. And in this situation, it's just a kind of a case of just reminder, just make it fundamentally fit. Make it fit within your kind of quote bank balance, make it fit within your calories, and you will be okay, regardless of where those calories come from. And I say that with a pinch of salt, because if we have some consideration over that, and I'll talk through the kind of more performance side of that in a minute, but if we have some consideration over that, then it's going to serve us really, really well. Now, in terms of kind of a rough calculation of energy balance, I've kind of put that here. Now, you can be a bit more specific in the sense of using things like the Harris and Benedict equation, which you can Google. I'm not going to run you through it. It's a bit more complex. But this is something that is really, really a quick way to do it. So you can literally get your calculator out and you can multiply your body weight in kilos by 22 if you're a female, or 24 if you're a male. Now, that will give you an approximation of your BMR. That's your basal metabolic rate. So if I was to say, just lie there, you are only allowed to blink and breathe. That is how many calories you would expend. That is not including any form of activity whatsoever, not even the kind of like the hand gestures, not even any steps, etc., etc. So it's the fundamental amount to basically to keep you alive. Then what you then have is you can then multiply this by your physical activity level. Now, this can extend from 1.1 to about 2.5. I've only ever, well, it can go higher actually, but I've only ever used 1.1 with someone with no lower limb function. And that's been once. And so they had no lower limb function, and thus I used 1.1. So even in these times where we are more sedentary, it's going to be a minimum of 1.2. Now, obviously, in terms of confinement and all the rest of it, there will be some consideration around it maybe slightly dropping. But we can take measures to boost it, just putting in things like step, trying to make a conscious effort to hit step goals. And then I would probably say that no one's going to be above 1.5, 1.4 at this time, particularly if we're living and if we are kind of social distancing and we are kind of keeping ourselves in our apartments. And so situating it in around 1.3 is not going to be a bad thing, or 1.375 is what I've put there. And a reminder that maintenance, first and foremost, is a range. And so there are some days where you will expend more and some days where you will expend less. And it's important to kind of just take note of that, because if we go into something like this with the expectation of, I am going to be so rigid with my nutrition, I'm going to aim for this calorie goal and this, well, and this is the kind of the thing that particularly at this, we have to acknowledge that we are emotive beings, we are social beings, we're emotionally driven, and that kind of thing. And so it isn't as simple as having the expectation of, we are going to eat the same calories every single day, because that might arguably be a bit unrealistic, but it's the same in the sense of expenditure. We're not going to expend the same every day. So I would look at making a lower limit and an upper limit, and then as a result, kind of forming a range between there. And then you can adjust according to your goal. What I know, I'll say this at this point. Now, what this does provide for those, this kind of situation does provide a greater opportunity within reason for a more, quote, fat loss approach. And I'll be quite specific in the way that I kind of go about this. Kind of engaging in CrossFit, in strength, use of barbells, dumbbells, they are quite neurally demanding. They have quite a high impact on something called your central nervous system. Now, your central nervous system is something that kind of governs a lot of processes within the body, but one of them is appetite regulation. And so we've seen it before. You might have done some form of workout at P10, and it can be quite high impact, and thus you've just felt like eating the world all day. Now, the way exercise impacts you will be quite specific to you. For example, those that kind of know me will know that my appetite is significantly impacted by things like high intensity weights training. So if I was to do a classical weights training with, say, a session which involved heavy power cleans, some back squatting, some deadlifting, a kind of a more barbell focused session, my body it responds well in terms of training stimulus. Cool, I'm going to get stronger, but I find that really taxing. And whereas I can do kind of hours of burpees, something more low impact but much more higher energy expenditure, and it doesn't affect me at all. Whereas some people are the other way around. They high amounts of cardio, high amounts of energy expenditure, that impacts their appetite. And so it's important to kind of make a note of that. However, because the exercise that we are engaging in is going to be something that is less impacting, it's going to be less neurally stimulating, and then as a result is going to impact our central nervous system in a decreased amount, then our appetite regulation is going to be far more efficient. I mean, and you see things like, you see kind of, say, Jane, who's 55 years old and slightly overweight, and she goes to Weight Watchers, and she's just able to be really, really aggressive and lose pound after pound after pound of body fat with no kind of massive consideration. She should be really aggressive in a calorie deficit. That's because she leads quite a low impact lifestyle. Whereas we have to acknowledge that as fantastic as weightlifting, CrossFit is, it does make it kind of slightly more difficult to be more aggressive in terms of a fat loss approach. So maybe if your goal is fat loss, then there is some consideration around doing it at this time. If that is your goal, of course, but I will say that there is some consideration about fundamentally managing behaviors and relationship with food in that sense. I'm just trying to see if there's any questions as well. Cool. What I will say as well is when you are kind of management of calorie intake, we go back to this idea because this is something that is probably, as I said, very unrealistic. We are in a position where we are looking to fundamentally manage our averages. We're looking to manage we are a sum of our averages. We're managing our calorie intake on the whole. And I always use an example of one client that I work with who was very kind of, quote, he owned a construction company. He was very jacked, the lads, loved basically binge drinking on a weekend. And it's something that I couldn't really get him out of. So his structure never changed, and so he would have 4,000 calories on a Saturday, which involved copious amounts of pints of beer. And despite having 4,000 calories, what we would do is just manage the other 6 days. Because if you have 6 days at 2,000 calories and then 1 day at 4,000 calories, your average is still only 2,285 calories. And so having this kind of consideration of what your weekly average is, then that's something that we can just kind of, particularly at a time like this, we can just kind of look to play what's in front of us. We can say, well, how was my eating yesterday and do I need to account for it? And then you can even do that and like I say, you can even do that on a kind of a month to month basis. And obviously, say if we are potentially in kind of a more isolation and social distancing for say the next 4 weeks, we can just evaluate it week to week and say, well, how was my week last week? And if it is something where the average maybe got away from you, you still have the ability to manage the average for the month. And I personally even think that looking at it week to week in that sense or managing the average for the week is a too small a time frame to think about it. And I would look at, well, how's my average been over the month/2 months? Obviously, the most obvious example you can give is this idea of managing calorie intake over in according to your menstrual cycle. Now, as I look at the guys when I talk about that, but the obviously it's well known that females can be an absolute nightmare at that time, and I have huge amounts of empathy. I feel as if I've vicariously lived it through many different females, and there's huge cravings with some females. There's huge and it can massively, there's huge emotion, and it can massively deter someone from their kind of goals. But if I use one female who I still work with, her nutrition structure has never changed. The week before her period, she has 2,300 calorie surplus, because she is fundamentally an emotional nightmare, and she doesn't really have any care she doesn't care of anything that I have to say. But we've just accounted for that. And so she'll go 2,300. The next week she goes about 1,700. The next week after that, she's a lot more aggressive and she's 1,300. And then she goes back up to about 15 something. And that average has then just meant she just rolls through it. Fat loss, fat loss, fat loss, fat loss. And again, this is in the context of fat loss. However, you just adjust the calories according to your goal. You adjust the calories according to the rate of body composition management in that sense. So if we want to have some degree of maintenance, we accept that within reason, overeating or an overconsumption of calories is part of life. And we accept that it's inevitable. And it's in isolated incidents, it's not something to overthink. However, if it's a case of 1 minute, Jay, I'll come to you in a minute. If it's a case of I've lost my train of thought, Jay, yes, go for it. Jay, I've unmuted you. I'm trying to.
Yeah, so sorry for disrupting you so much. So you're talking about like maintenance in caloric intake and stuff.
Yeah,
At the beginning, you touched on resistances as well, and like obviously in this training time, a lot of us, including myself, who've been used to regular strength training, don't have the same sort of stimulus as we would be used to. In my previous military service, I was very used to going on long periods of time away without getting that high level of resistance or strength training in and then coming back. But during that time away, what I'd do is I'd overeat, end up heavy. So I'd come back and lift the same weights as when I left.
yeah.
And then I'd go through a period of kind of like leaning out. Would you say like that was through no, like I've zero knowledge, but that was just kind of how it worked. And there was also a lot of peanut butter on board a ship. So that was easy. But like, I'm wondering if what your viewpoint is on that, and whether for those of us who've built up this strength over a long period of time, or what would your approach to that be?
Well, that is it's definitely a method. So in the sense of like we acknowledge that mass moves mass, and a maintenance of strength can come from just being heavier first and foremost, but pound for pound you're weaker. However, as well as that, what you are and I will go in. This is actually something I will cover, so I'm just going to briefly kind of go over this, because one of the kind of the key components of a maintenance of your performance is going to be your consistency of energy availability, the consistency of your calorie intake as a whole. And so if you're supporting that with what is a calorie surplus, then that can be something that serves you. And I'll talk through, there is some macronutrient considerations. Is it completely necessary? No. Because you can mitigate these things through kind of macronutrient ratios and kind of managing food intake as a whole. But for those that are kind of listening and those that are kind of will listen retrospectively, that's definitely a kind of consideration that you might want to have in terms of, okay, I am going to use this as a small controlled bulk. I hate that word. And then within reason, you can then periodize your nutrition after it to then offset that and use it to your advantage in the same way that it sounds like JJ did back in his military days. I'd say it's not essential, but it could be a way. It could be a way of basically managing behaviors, if that makes sense. Because if we are just accepting of like, okay, well, we'll talk through the specifics of how you could manage this and considerations in a moment. But if we're just accepting that, okay, I'm going to go through a small calorie surplus, and you utilize that to your advantage, it might lead to much more consistency over this period of time in your behaviors, which will serve you far more better than kind of having this kind of undulating calorie intake as a whole, particularly in the management of performance. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, it helps. Thank you very much.
Cool. If anyone does have any questions, then please raise your hand. It comes up as a note on my screen that it can raise your hands. Danny, I'm going to mute you now. Go for it.
Yes, so regarding the recommended 10,000 steps a day, obviously now it's not going to be possible, especially if there's going to be a lockdown, we don't know. Yes. How in terms of like weight loss or like not gaining weight, will that impact? Because I mean, I'm sitting all day or like standing, but I'm in my room, in the kitchen, as everyone, I guess, like.
Yeah, of course.
They're not getting that many steps.
So the reason why 10,000 steps is the recommendation, because for an average size human, both male and female, well, I say average size human in terms of body weight, that equates to about 80 kilos. So 10,000 steps is equal to 500 calories approximately worth of calorie expenditure. And so what you can do, and obviously if we go to here, 500 calories with deficit is equal times by 7, 10,000 is 1 pound of body fat a week. So I would just say, okay, obviously in the context of you, Danny, you're not 80 kilos, but you can kind of offset that in the sense. But then at the same time, I'd be like, don't write yourself off. Like, I mean, I've been pacing around my flat. I've been obviously I've been working and stuff today and all the rest of it, taking calls, like, and just not stopping moving. And so in terms of like one of the most positive behaviors that we can kind of get into, and this is outside of kind of quarantined life, is a higher activity levels. It is your what's called your NEAT, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and which is fundamentally just your step count. And there is other things like fidgeting with your hands, that's NEAT as well. But trying to promote that, and I would argue to not just be accepting of a 2,000 step count of a day, and just make a point. Like, and reality is, like, what else is there to do? So you can adjust your calorie intake accordingly. So say if for an 80 kilo individual, it's around 500 calories, but then for maybe slightly lighter, it's going to be 350 and all the rest of it, and then just kind of run it by that. And then what I will say particularly in terms of the calculation of where you should situate your calorie intake, just like run it by me. I'm here. So ask those questions and I'll happily answer them.
Thank you.
Cool. Sanjay. I'm just going to unmute you. Go for it, buddy. I think you should be able to. Hold on. 1 minute. Why can I not?
Hello, can you hear me?
Go for it.
All right, yeah. So for those of us who have desk jobs, how much do you think the actual reduction in, I guess, energy expenditure is there? Because I guess, like, from my perspective, I'm stretching a lot more now. I'm moving around a lot more as opposed to being sat at my desk for 8 hours straight.
Yeah.
But then that's obviously sort of counteracted with, maybe slightly less volume or intensity from training. And like how do you sort of figure out that balance on how much to scale back without scaling back too much, if that makes sense? Because I guess no one wants to scale back too much if they don't have to.
Yeah, well, what are you saying? No one wants to reduce their calorie intake if they don't have to, basically.
Yeah.
No, completely. I mean, there's loads of different kind of points of metrics that you can kind of take on board. I would look at scale weight fluctuations would be one that I would look at. And in terms of particularly, there's going to be naturally undulating fluctuations. But if it becomes a point of like you see a difference of, I need to get this right. You see a difference. I'm going to fact check myself in a moment, but it's going to be, and if you see a difference of about 0.8 of a kilo or more in your average scale weight from week to week. So that's a daily scale measurement. And you take all of them, you add them together and then divide them by 7. And then you compare that week 1 with week 2. If there's a difference in that, then I would have consideration over kind of slight reduction. If it's any less than that, then I would just probably say you're kind of all okay. But then that's just quite generally, like I say, the variables that do impact that are quite are huge, and it depends on how consistent your macronutrient ratio is. And then as well as that, there will be consideration over just like the more qualitative points of feedback, like the way that your energy levels are, the way that your appetite is, the way that your like I say, your clothes are fitting and stuff like that. It's like there is a lot of intuition within that, but I would be in a sense that particularly for those with desk jobs, you are probably maybe more active, particularly if you're engaging in stretching and all the rest of it. So your energy expenditure might not be that different. However, there might be some consideration around kind of macronutrient if you're being that anal about it, but I'll run through that in a minute. Is there any more questions before I move on? Cool. Right, so then we want to just kind of, let's talk macronutrients. Let's talk, so macronutrients is basically it is an umbrella term for carbohydrates, fats, and protein, which is basically what it means. And we're going to kind of touch upon, I mean, this applies in and out the gym, but then this is something that we can look at to our advantage, because there are principles here that may well serve us during this time, or considerations that may serve us during this time. And as I've said, kind of alluded to, consistent energy availability is one of the number one factors. And that is consistency in calorie intake. And so building a range of calories that, so it's not a case of, okay, today I have 800 calories, and then the next day I have 3,600 calories, or what, like I say, seeing some clients who have a normal amount of calories and then just basically binge. And what that brings is, fundamentally, if you manage your averages, it's not going to be that detrimental. Like if I go back to the guy that I used to work with, in terms of he used to binge drink every weekend, he still effectively lost body fat. He still effectively kind of worked towards his goal. However, that is then, so I put it will, if we undereat or if we overeat, there will be small fluctuations in your hormones, which will, we know it. Like you've been out, you've either overeaten, and the next day you feel quite lethargic, or when we undereat, particularly when we undereat consistently, there'll start to be a downregulation in certain hormones, which is the body's natural response, which again will kind of start to basically lead to lethargy, maybe decrease in mood, decrease in performance, and all the rest of it. And so if we can, particularly for those, if we're looking at the maintenance of performance, and we take kind of fat loss out of the equation here, trying to maintain a consistent energy availability is going to serve us as best as possible. And this kind of goes back to when we get back in the gym. In terms of the number one factor, people kind of get hung up on what some of the other things that maybe I'll talk through. But if there's a mismanagement of calories and we're not serving ourselves and we're not placing our calories in the right place, then it can be, like I say, you're missing the most important factor. So just bear that in mind. And the kind of the main thing is that it can lead to, like I say, maybe not the most optimal of decisions in that sense. So, I mean, variety, when this is something I'll touch upon in a moment, but variety promotes appetite, and obviously the exposure to certain foods psychologically can trigger cravings and all these kind of stuff that might not serve us in that sense. The main things, and this is where, so like that, we've very much been about kind of a calorie is a calorie at this stage, whereas this is where it kind of starts to get a bit different. One of the biggest things that you can do to mitigate, quote, loss of gains is have some consideration around your protein intake. Now, what happens is the process of retention or development of muscle mass, depending on, so retention and development, it depends on what stimulus you kind of give the body, comes from a stimulation of something called muscle protein synthesis. And what that is a process that is stimulated by your training. Training is the best kind of mechanism to stimulate this process. But you also do this through the consumption of protein. And so because we've lost huge amounts of resistance training, there becomes a greater consideration around management of your protein intake. Now, what this looks like then is having a greater consideration of, first and foremost, your total protein intake, your net protein intake for the day. As well as that, protein is the most satiating macronutrient. So there is a hormone called leptin that sends a signal from the stomach to the brain, tells you you're full. This is best triggered by protein. And so in terms of management of appetite, having consistency of protein feedings can help manage our energy levels. It can help manage just kind of manage that idea of just appetite on the whole. As well as that, like I say, I mean, if we're being really kind of specific in terms of how it can also influence energy expenditure, which may or may not lead to fat loss, it depends on how you situate the rest of your calories. There's something called the thermic effect of feeding, which is basically when we consume calories, we require calories to burn calories. So the process of digesting calories requires energy, right? So if I wanted to kind of break this table, it's going to require energy for me to break it. And it's the same kind of thing. So it's the sense of, if I have 100 calories of carbohydrate that I consume, I will only absorb about 90% of them, and I'll utilize 10% of them in the process of breaking it down. Fat is even less. It can be anywhere between, you can absorb anywhere from 97% to 100% of the calories. It's a much more efficient process. And then as well as that, protein, then you only will absorb 70% of the calories, and then you will utilize 30% of them in the process of metabolizing and breaking it down. And so within that, if you have 2 days that are exactly the same in terms of energy expenditure and then even calorie intake, so on both days you have 2,000 calories, but on one day you have 150 grams of protein, but on the other day you have 75 grams of protein, you will literally have a higher energy expenditure on that day, on the day that you have the 150 grams of protein, because you will have absorbed less calories in that sense. So there is some consideration around managing your energy deficit there. But the main thing that I would kind of look at is this from a point of view of mitigating muscle loss. Now, the first thing that I would say is that the rate of muscle loss probably isn't as fast as you think, particularly engaging in kind of home workout sessions and just generally staying active. There may be some considerations because you're not necessarily getting as much exposure to resistance, but that can largely come through, first and foremost, stimulation of muscle, but also just body stores and a couple of other variables like that. And so what we basically want to do is have some consideration around stimulating this muscle protein synthesis process as frequently as possible. Now, bear with me with this, and I'm going to expect questions, but I'm going to try and explain this as best as possible. So the stimulation of this process comes from, first and foremost, training, but then as well as that, it also comes from consumption of protein. Now, in order to maximally stimulate this process, it requires you to hit something called your leucine threshold. Those that work with me will know all about this. Now, basically what that is that when we consume protein is broken down into amino acids. There's 20 of them. And all you need to know is that one of them is called leucine. Now, what I want you to think about in terms of this muscle retaining process, it's like a gun, basically. Now, what you have is 20 amino acids, which are broken down from protein. So when I consume a chicken breast, it gets broken down into 20 amino acids. 19 amino acids of these form the bullet, in the sense of this bullet of amino acids is going to go out and it's going to either retain your muscle mass or it's going to build your muscle mass. Then from there, leucine is the trigger. And so what we need to do is hit a certain amount of leucine to be able to fire off this process. Now, what does this look like in terms of everyday life? You have to then this is how we work out our leucine threshold here. You take your body weight in kilos and multiply it by 0.03. So if I have a 70 kilo individual, then I require 2.1 grams of leucine to maximally stimulate this process. Then you convert that into actual protein amount by 9, multiplying that number by 9. And so for a 70 kilo individual, all they need is 18.9 or 19 grams of protein to maximally stimulate this process. And this is where the myth of you can only absorb a certain amount of protein comes from at one time, because once you reach this threshold, then your body will kind of not stop utilizing the protein, but then it will just basically anything on top of that. So for example, a chicken breast is 45 grams of protein, approximately, give or take the size. And so anything above that, the remainder of the 45 grams will just be drip fed into the bloodstream over time, as opposed to being utilized there and then, but it still gets utilized. And so what we can basically have then, and one of the things that I would suggest you doing, is can you work out your leucine threshold and what that looks like in how that directly transfers into protein intake, and then can you stimulate that? Can you consume that as frequently as possible throughout the day? So 3 to 5 portions of protein. And so if you have this 70 kilo individual, can you consume a minimum, you can go higher than this, a minimum of 19 grams of protein as frequently as possible throughout the day? And that is going to go a long way to offset any loss of gains in that sense. And we'll have huge consideration around the management of our muscle mass. There is, as I said, some consideration around the net total amount. Now, I would be inclined, so normally we can kind of situate protein in the sense of anywhere between 1.2 grams per kilo of body weight all the way up to 2.5 grams. I mean, you can go even higher. There's studies done that have had 4 grams per kilo of body weight. And as a result, I would have some consideration around the net total amount, because this is only going to kind of enhance that. So particularly at this time, I would have some consideration around just trying to increase it on the whole. Yes, have the frequency there if you can, but then fundamentally, if you can have the idea of maybe working towards 2 grams, 2.2, even 2.5 grams. If I'm being honest, I normally aim for about 1.8 personally. So I aim for about 1.8 grams per kilo of body weight. And no, I'm waiting for JJ to put in something about that being 300 grams of protein. And then I'm increasing it to 2.5 grams. I'm making a conscious effort. If I do anything during this time of quarantine, I'm trying to push it towards 2.5 grams, just around because my training's different, and I'm not getting exposure to as much resistance in that sense. Does anyone if you have any questions, just raise your hands very quickly. Otherwise, I'll move on to around kind of carbohydrate. Cool. Awesome. So the next one is in terms of carbohydrate. So the only thing is with carbohydrate, there's no right or wrong. Carbohydrates and fat have no bearing on your body composition, providing that calories, etc., are equated for. Now, the demands of the day is generally how we kind of calculate your carbohydrate intake, but it doesn't really matter. Largely comes down to preference. I personally prefer a higher carbohydrate diet. I don't eat as much fat. But if you are someone that likes your bacon and your avocado, and you've done well, you've got hold of that during these kind of times, then yeah, it's something that it doesn't really matter. And so there is that kind of thing. Now, the thing is with carbohydrate is that, so 1 gram of carbohydrate is equal to 4 calories, whereas 1 gram of fat is equal to 9 calories. We know fat is more calorie dense. You will get more bang for your buck. You will get more food volume by increasing your carbohydrate. And when we look at the stimulation of satiety, we do very much, it can as well be a psychological thing. We do eat with our eyes and all this kind of thing. So there is some considerations there. Now, I put a big word on the screen there called de novo lipogenesis, which is a really, really straightforward kind of process. Well, it's not a straightforward process, but it's a straightforward principle. And this basically means when you have a surplus of calories, you have to run the risk of basically turning that directly into body fat. If this surplus of calories comes from carbohydrate, then it is a really, really difficult process to happen. It's an expensive process for the body to go through. And so, as I said before, maintenance levels of calories is a range. And so by naturally striving to maintain your calorie or body composition, there are some days where you're going to be in a calorie surplus and some days where you'll be a deficit, and some days you might even hit it bang on. Who knows? So within that, what we can do is, and this goes back to what JJ was saying earlier, is that you can basically enforce a calorie surplus. And if you are going to enforce a calorie surplus, do it with carbohydrates, because the means of turning excess carbohydrates, so only in a calorie surplus, directly into body fat is really, really difficult. It's expensive. Whereas fat, as an example, is a really straightforward process of turning directly into body fat. You can, if you have, say, a 200 calorie surplus in the day, and then and your surplus is made up of fat, you can bet that, I've just done the calculations here, that you will put on 22 grams of body fat if you have a 200 calorie surplus. Now, 22 grams in the scheme of things isn't anything to be too concerned about. However, it is, like I say, you can mitigate that by just having a higher carb approach. And particularly if you are going to accept the fact that you're going to be in some form of calorie surplus, like it's why bodybuilders will be in, quote, their off season, and they'll be kind of going for bulking, and they will have stupidly high carbohydrate levels. I mean, I've worked with a few previously, and like I say, when we've done it, there's been some that have had 700, 800 grams of carbohydrate, but then their fat intake has been really, really low, like 50, 60 grams, which in the context is a really difficult thing to achieve. So you might think, great, 700 grams worth of carbohydrate. I mean, I gave something similar to Sal, and he was moaning about eating tiger bread. All he did was like moan about eating tiger bread. And it's fun for one day, but when you limit your fat intake, it really limits your food choices. And this is one of the considerations around fat. When you increase your fat intake, you have more versatility, you have more flexibility within your diet. In terms of, it is important to have, like fat is an essential macronutrient. We need it to stay alive. Protein is an essential macronutrient. We need it to stay alive, whereas carbohydrate isn't, so we can afford to be a bit more compromising on that. So whilst we are here, I would have some, in this kind of more isolated environment, and we've got a lot more control over our food, and particularly, like I've noticed in myself, I have quite a low fat diet anyway, but then it's dropped even more, just because I'm being a lot more consistent with the food choices that I'm having. And so we need to make sure. Now, the literature says that you should have a minimum of 15% of your daily calorie intake from fat. I personally think that is too low, and I think that it should be more like 22%. I'm not just plucking that out of the air. That's just based off of research papers, of course, but minimum of kind of 15%, 22, but 22% is something better to go through. So if you have, for example, if you're aiming for 2,000 calories, I would say that, oops, do my maths right, I would say that we needed to have a minimum of 48 grams of body fat as a minimum, and it's something to kind of just achieve. Now, the only thing is, and I put here, so we know, particularly more so than ever, that we want to have some consideration around this muscle protein synthesis process. It is important in the management of our retention of our muscle mass. It is an important thing to do. Now, what happens is fat basically slows gastric emptying. It passes through, it digests really slowly, really slowly. And so what happens is this can dampen your muscle protein synthesis response. And so there isn't much to say about this other than I might have some consideration around limiting your fat intake in and around your workout times, more so than ever, because we want to enhance this kind of process, and your training to some extent will do that, particularly if you've got access to some kit, and we can't really, because it's going to be a compromised stimulation, if you like, from your training. We want to kind of minimize any kind of dampening effect coming from our food intake. So keeping your fat intake as low as possible is going to be a really positive thing in and around your training. However, what I would say is, just remind you, it's not essential. If we want to fundamentally manage our calorie intake, and if we want to manage our body composition, just do that. What we're talking about here is, quote, more optimal strategies, and optimal strategies in terms of performance, but then will also maybe help just facilitate a bit of structure in and around your nutrition, because it's very easy to kind of get sidetracked and all the rest of it from that kind of point of view. So yes, these things are great. Yes, these things can really bind us to our nutrition in a time which can be like, we can help us, just give us a bit more focus. But then at the same time, if it doesn't happen one day for whatever reason, it's not the end of the world. And I will just go back to this. If you can end the day to say that you've been fairly consistent in your energy availability, then that's one of the main things. Tick the box, move on to the next. So yeah, is there any questions? There's someone in the chat that I need to see, but I can't see it. If you how do I see the chat? Get used to this. Whoever's put something in the chat, I can't see it for some reason. It is not gonna. I might just have to stop sharing my screen for a moment.
It's me, mate. It's not important.
Right. Okay. Cool. Can we ask questions at the end? Yes. Right. I mean, if anyone wants that, you can ask questions at the end for sure. I'll tell you what, I've got one other thing to go through, and then any questions at the end, then please just go fire them through. Because one of the things that we want to have kind of consideration of is like say, how do we approach this time? We can, as I said at the beginning, we can physiologically and psychologically look to manage appetite. We can look to have some control over, we can use food as a real crutch in this time to, like I say, give us some real focus and purpose to what we're kind of working towards, particularly with it being so uncertain. And so I made these really, you can tell I made these notes really, really quickly before. And so there's a number of different ways. So I just want to run you through a couple of ways in terms of how we attack this. We can first and foremost maintain flexibility. You might think, you know what, I actually trust myself. I want to maintain this flexibility. We want to, I've got no reason not to trust myself, and I'm just going to play it day to day. And I'm going to be flexible in my food choices. And if that is you, then fantastic. I will only encourage that. But I would also make a note of trend in behaviors. So if you are seeing yourself become less motivated, if you're seeing your calorie intake starting to rise, if you are seeing, like I say, some difficulties and your food intake not aligning itself in the way that you want it to, you note it. However, if it's just a one-off, don't overthink it. If you have one day that's kind of overfeeding, again, don't overthink it. It's not the end of the world. It's the same thing about, like, although I find it hilarious, I use the football analogy. I find it hilarious how Liverpool aren't going to win the title, but Liverpool lost against Watford. They lost against Watford the other week. And does that all of a sudden make them a bad team? No. Does that all of a sudden make them not worthy enough to win the Premiership? No.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Well, I would argue the same thing. But so if it is just isolated in that, don't overthink it. If there is a trend in struggle, that's when it's like, right, okay, I need to get a hold of this. Now, one of the things in which you could look to do is utilize your nutrition. And large parts of it is we're in a food environment that is quite compromising. We have high food focus. We have everything is just, food availability is just there. It's 2 steps away. And maybe, I don't know, there's this concept of mindful eating, which maybe I'll kind of look to do. No, I'll touch upon some things now. But what we can first and foremost do is look to create some sort of structure to remove decision-making within our diet. And that just then kind of just makes things black and white. Now, a lot of the work that personally that I do is that I look to kind of put food as to try and help people to be quite fluid in their food intake. People use food as a point of creating control in their life. And I am of the opinion that we should kind of be a lot more fluid about it, and we should be more versatile in our ability to manage our behaviors. But I would also argue that in a time like now, using food as a crutch of control in our life might be a positive thing, depending on the individual, of course. And so what we can do is, as humans, we like black and white. We like yes, no. We like Labour, Conservative. There's no kind of middle ground. And like it's like one of why people get drawn to something like the ketogenic diet, because it's just like, can I eat this? Is it on the list? Yes. Can I eat this? Is it on the list? No. And it's just either or. There's no black. It's just so black and white, and you just follow that structure, and it facilitates calorie deficit in a ketogenic diet, the state of ketosis. Sorry, and it, like I say, it might work for some. I mean, in my opinion, it's not great, but that's why people are drawn to it, because it's very, very black and white. Do that, stick to it, and it works. And because it removes that idea of decision making. It's not like, oh, do I fancy bread? No, you can't have bread. And so it just removes these kind of quote trigger foods potentially. And so some of the considerations that I would have here is, how do we potentially remove decision making within this time? Well, the most obvious one is creating some form of eating window. I put intermittent fasting there. Now, intermittent fasting isn't something that's superior to anything. It's just a way of maintaining calories, managing your calorie intake. If you reduce the window in which you eat, you will naturally reduce the opportunity that you have to overeat. And again, we as kind of emotionally driven beings like the idea of, I'm hungry. Is it in my eating window? Yes, we'll eat. Is it in my eating window? No, then don't eat. And like I say, it just creates this very black and white thinking. Now I put here, and this kind of, to be honest, we've done some stuff with some of the athletes that I work with, and management of ghrelin, and this comes around from kind of 2 points. So first and foremost, ghrelin is just the hunger hormone, signaling hormone. It's basically, it sends a signal and says, I'm hungry. And it is something that first and foremost can be trained. In the sense of, what we can do is, so if I was to start intermittent fasting tomorrow, then what would happen is I would get hungry, because I generally eat at around, I don't know, 8 or 9, and my hunger is aligned with that. And so what would happen is, particularly if you go between 10 and 21 days, which it is likely that we will be in some form of lockdown for minimum, then what we can start to do is play upon this notion of ghrelin being trained, being like a puppy dog, and kind of utilize it to our advantage. So if I start to then create a strategy where I eat at similar times, then what I can do is just basically set an alarm on my phone to eat. And then, has my alarm gone off? Yes. Eat. Has my alarm gone off? No, don't eat. And it removes the decision making from the game. As well as that, what you will then start to do, particularly if you do this consistently for 10 to 21 days, your hunger signals then will start to align themselves with the time that the alarm goes off. And thus making the ability to manage your appetite a lot easier in that sense. And so you kind of kill two birds with one stone. And then if you tie that into what we were saying about protein and having that frequency of protein, then it just builds that kind of consistency with that, and it's a kind of an alarm for that as well. And that kind of ties in with the notion of timing strategies and stuff like that. And so, yeah, it's just having, it's not essential, but these are all tools that you can have in your locker. And particularly if you aim to have some sort of flexibility, just manage your averages, and that doesn't quite serve you. Or if you're worried about, quote, boredom eating and all these kind of stuff, then just look to just refine your structure and have this idea of kind of control over it. The last one is something called taste fatigue or palate fatigue that I will kind of cover. I mean, in terms of like creating, quote, diet structures, there are so many. And it's just finding the right one for you. Now, I've just kind of identified the most clear and obvious ones, but there are, I mean, if you want to bounce ideas around finding one for you, you know where I am. I'll just say that. The last one is something called taste fatigue, palate fatigue. And so within this is a phenomenon which basically, when you overload the same sensory stimulus, it becomes fatigued. So what we have is sensory patterns, neurons that run from the tongue to the brain. If we stimulate them in the same way, they become fatigued. And so, for example, it's the same way that if I asked you to do a load of push-ups, then your arms would become fatigued and you wouldn't want to do any more push-ups. And so what we have here is something that we can play upon. Because if we stimulate the body in the same with the same food, or stimulate the senses with the same food, these sensory patterns get overused and they become fatigued. And then as a result, our appetite downregulates. And the way, to be honest, the way in which I first came across this is I did when I was doing a nutrition internship years and years ago. I went and did some work at an elderly care home, and they were just finding that the residents just weren't just had no appetite, and they just weren't eating enough, and as a result were becoming, like I say, were experiencing difficulties. And so the only strategy that we did was just promote variety within our diet, and as a result excuse me, their coronavirus, as a result their appetite went up. And it's this notion of there's always room for dessert. It's this notion of always room for dessert, because you've gone from savory, and then all of a sudden you're stimulating it with a sweet sensation, and then we're somehow, even though feeling full, we're able to facilitate that. And in the sense of, it's like Christmas Day. I mean, I read one paper that said that the average American consumes 6,000 calories on Christmas Day, and that is because that's actually quite a difficult thing to do. Well, I'd argue that, but it is. I know Sanjay would argue that, but that because there is just huge sensory stimulation, and it differs. You go from starting the day with chocolate, then you have your Weetabix, then you have your roast dinner, then you have some more sweet something sweet, and then and it's just back and forth between different like stimuluses. And so you can reverse engineer this process and create a structure that basically plays upon this. And again, it's basically giving, so the way what it would look like in its application would be having 2 options for breakfast, 2 options for lunch, 2 options for dinner. And in a time where you question the notion of food availability is uncertain, and we don't know what, and the notion of variety within our diet probably isn't going to be something we're going to promote or even have the facility to be able to promote. This might be a consideration. And if you can be strict with this, or it removes the decision making, because what am I going to have for breakfast? Well, I've either got this or this. Cool. What am I having for lunch? I've got this or this. It removes decision making, and there's another means of down regulation of appetite in that sense. And so, yeah, is it essential? No. But is it something that can help? 100%. 100%. And so, yeah, and then just having these ideas to be like, okay, I would argue that we'd probably want to strive for some sort of flexibility and norm, but in the times where it might just start to get away from us, we just start to tighten things up, then cool. That's the way I'd go about it. In terms of kind of like content, I'm just going to stop the share there. Is there any questions? Is there any questions? Are we all good? Are we all good? I'll just double check. Jay, did you have a question, or are you good?
No, I'm fine.
Cool. Awesome. Well, that concludes everything, and I hope you've kind of found it of value. And if you do have any questions off the back of it, then please just let me know. One of the things that I will just say is that this will be the first one. This will be the only solo one that I'll do, where it's just me. I am looking forward to Thursday, where I've already got kind of people lined up, and then we'll just go from there. I hope you're all well. If you're in for the session tomorrow, you'll see my face. And then, other than that, I hope you have a fantastic evening, team, one and all. And I hope you're staying safe and keeping well. Take care.
See you later, everyone.
See you later, guys. See you tomorrow.